May 26th, 1989. Kelowna, British Columbia. While taking a lengthy backpacking trip through Canada, 20-year-old British national Charles Horvath cashes a cheque at a bank, but soon vanishes without a trace. After not hearing from him for several months, Charles's mother, Denise Allan, travels to Kelowna to perform a search and learns that Charles was staying at a local campground until he abruptly disappeared and left his personal belongings behind. Over the years, there are a number of leads, including an anonymous note which states that Charles was killed at the campground before he was dumped in the lake, but there are no conclusive answers about what happened to him. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a missing persons case from our podcast's home country of Canada, the 1989 disappearance of Charles Horvath. This story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and as you can imagine, I've received a ton of requests to cover it over the years. Charles Horvath was originally born in Ontario, but when his parents divorced, he spent the majority of his childhood living with his mother, Denise Allan, in her native England. When he was 20 years old, Charles decided to travel back to Canada in order to perform an extensive backpacking trip across the country, which would last for nearly a year. But sometime after he arrived in British Columbia, Charles seized all contact with his mother and vanished without a trace. Over the next 3 decades, Denise would make a number of trips to Canada in order to search for her son and chase down some odd leads, including an anonymous note alleging that Charles was killed during an altercation before his body was dumped into a lake, but he has still never been found. One thing we do know for certain is that Charles had been staying at a campground in Kelowna at the time he went missing and left all of his personal belongings there, and since this campground was known for having a shady reputation, there has been a lot of speculation that it held the answers about what happened to Charles. But even though there have always been a lot of rumors and hearsay surrounding this case, there is very little in the way of hard evidence. Denise Allan is an amazing advocate who has searched tirelessly for her son since 1989 and has done interviews on some true crime podcasts such as Mike Morford's Missing Persons and YouTube shows like Jason Hebert True Crime and Missing Persons. But even though she is now in her mid-70s, Denise is making one final push to seek the truth about Charles's disappearance, which is why I felt that now would be an ideal time to finally put together an episode about this case. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Charles Horvath. Our story begins in Canada in 1989, and our central figure is 20-year-old Charlie John Horvath, who goes by the name Charles. Charles was originally born in the community of Kelowna, Ontario, to his Hungarian father, Max Charlie Horvath, and British mother, Denise Horvath. Denise had emigrated from England to Canada in order to work as a nanny for a family in Vancouver, British Columbia. While there, Denise became acquainted with Max, and only 3 days after they met, he decided to propose to her and they soon got married. When she was only 19 years old, Denise became pregnant with Max's child and gave birth to a baby boy, and since Denise was feeling homesick, the couple would move to England with their son only 5 weeks after he was born. However, the marriage soon fell apart, and Max and Denise divorced 10 months later. Since immigration had issued Max an incorrect visa when he arrived in England, he returned to Canada, so Denise wound up getting full custody of their son and raised him as a single mother in her hometown of Halifax in West Yorkshire. The reason Charles earned his nickname is because one of his school teachers kept mistakenly calling him Carol instead of his given birth name, Carolee, and since Charles was the English equivalent of that Hungarian name, Denise started permanently referring to him as Charles to avoid the confusion. At one point, Denise attempted to reconcile with Max and returned to Canada with Charles in order to live with Max in Montreal, but things did not work out, so Denise took her son back to England. Even though Denise described Charles as being hyperactive and not particularly easy to raise, they formed a very close relationship. He would remain Denise's only child, and she eventually got remarried to a man named Stuart Allan. In 1988, right after he turned 20 years old, Charles decided that he wanted to return to his birth country of Canada and embark on a lengthy backpacking trip. His mother agreed to purchase him a plane ticket as a birthday gift, and Charles traveled to Montreal in September of that year. He lived there for a few months, working various odd jobs to support himself. This included a modeling assignment, and Denise would even make a trip to Montreal in December in order to see Charles participate in a fashion show, unaware that this would be the last time she would ever see him in person. When 1989 rolled around, Charles started heading west throughout Canada and took some time to visit his father Max and half-brother Max Jr. in Thunder Bay, Ontario, as well as his godfather in Coconhour. Charles then continued west and spent some time staying and working in places like Swift Current, Saskatchewan and Banff, Alberta. On April the 17th, while working at the Rimrock Hotel in Banff, Charles had what turned out to be his final phone conversation with his mother. Since Charles's 21st birthday and Denise's 40th birthday took place around the same time in August, they decided that they would meet up in Hong Kong in order to celebrate them, as Denise had spent a good portion of her childhood living there when her own father was in the Navy. Charles soon left Banff and continued traveling west to British Columbia, arriving in the city of Kelowna on May the 3rd. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, Charles would spend his time staying at the Kelowna Gospel Mission and was taken in by some local residents he befriended, including a couple named Lou and Libby Sherwood, who allowed Charles to temporarily crash with them. He registered at a number of student employment agencies in the area in hopes of finding work, and got a job at an amusement park called Flintstone's Bedrock City. On May the 11th, Charles faxed his mother a letter from the Roche stationers in Kelowna in order to inform her about the cost of flights for his planned trip to meet her in Hong Kong. He was planning to contact Denise at a later time in order to make arrangements to pay for the plane ticket, but this would turn out to be the last time she ever heard from him. The last date that Charles was officially confirmed to be alive was on May the 26th, when he worked the morning shift at Flintstone's Bedrock City, picked up his paycheck, and then cashed it at a bank at the Orchard Park shopping center. But what happened to Charles afterward has remained an unsolved mystery for the past 3 decades. Even though Charles had remained in constant touch with his mother throughout his trip, Denise did not receive any letters, postcards, or phone calls from him over the next few months, which was very uncharacteristic. By the time August rolled around, Denise had still not heard from Charles about arranging their Hong Kong trip, so she became incredibly concerned. On August the 10th, Denise decided to contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, aka the RCMP, in order to officially report Charles missing. However, the RCMP were not particularly helpful, as they informed Denise that since Charles was over 18, he was technically a legal adult, and stated, quote, if he didn't want to call his mom, he didn't have to. Over the course of the next year, Denise heard nothing from Charles, and the RCMP would not perform an investigation, so in June of 1990, Denise and her mother, Edith Thorpe, decided to travel to British Columbia in order to perform their own search. They eventually arrived in Kelowna and stayed at a hotel called the Pandosi Inn, and by pure coincidence, it turned out that the last location Charles was known to have stayed was located directly across the street from them. Denise learned that in May of 1989, Charles had settled at a campground called the Tiny Town Tent and Trailer Park, located on Lakeshore Road near Okanagan Lake, and he stayed in a tent which had been given to him by a local charity. According to Denise, when she first arrived at the campground to inquire about Charles, she spoke to a resident named Kevin Trent Egan, who seemed very nervous and evasive, and said she would have to speak to the manager when he arrived. When Denise spoke to the manager, Phil Flett, he did remember Charles and claimed that 1 year earlier, Charles had abruptly disappeared from the campground, leaving behind his tent, sleeping bag, and all of his personal belongings. Flett packed up all of Charles's belongings and put them into storage, but when Charles failed to return to reclaim them, Flett said that he disposed of most of the items the following spring. By this point, the only belongings which Flett still had in his possession were a rosary, a tiny red paper Bible, and a leather strap from Charles's boot, which he provided to Denise. This concerned Denise enough that she paid a visit to the Kelowna detachment of the RCMP in order to ask them to perform a missing persons investigation for Charles. They told her that they would pass his file along to their homicide division and get in touch with Interpol in order to acquire Charles's dental records. But according to Denise, one of the investigators, Constable Norm Blaney, made some very disturbing comments as he expressed his belief that Charles was dead and that she would never find his body or learn what happened to him, stating, quote, "You just do not know how evil they are at the tiny town campsite." When the RCMP performed their own search of the campground, they obtained Charles's shaving bag and 2 shirts which had belonged to him from Kevin Trent Egan. Charles had used the shaving bag to carry his identification and family photographs, but Egan had since disposed of these items. Investigators also learned that Phil Flett's girlfriend had taken 2 of Charles's sweaters, though she later apologized to Denise and gave them back. When Charles's disappearance made the local newspapers, Denise was contacted by a Kelowna resident named Joanne Zebroff. Joanne claimed that she had befriended Charles during the spring of 1989 and allowed him to temporarily stay with her at an apartment she shared with her mother. Joanne said that the last time she heard from Charles was when he made a surprise visit to her apartment and spoke to her over the intercom. While Charles wanted to see Joanne, her brother was actually in town visiting her for a special family reunion, so Joanne told Charles she was unable to invite him inside before he left. Joanne's account would cause some confusion with the timeline, because even though she was certain that the visit took place in May of 1989, the RCMP would come to believe that it actually occurred in July of that year. Details are murky, but they apparently checked with Joanne's brother's employer and learned that he had taken time off in order to visit Joanne sometime in July. What also complicated matters is that Joanne was certain she had seen Charles at the Live Wire nightclub in Kelowna in August of 1989, and even though they never spoke, Joanne recalled waving at him from a distance before he waved back. If these sightings were accurate, then this meant that Charles was alive for at least 2 months after he left the tiny town campground, but his whereabouts during that time period could not be established. Investigators did explore the possibility that Charles decided to disappear voluntarily, particularly after speaking with his paternal aunt Georgette, who lived in eastern Canada with her daughter and son. They all claimed that Charles once told them he had thought about, quote-unquote, disappearing off the face of the earth because he wanted to carry on with his own life and his mother would never find him. However, Denise heavily disputed this, as she had never gotten along with Georgette since her marriage with Max came to an end, and believed that Georgette and her husband were fabricating these claims in order to spite her. Indeed, during their brief time together, Joanne said that Charles often showed her photographs of his mother and seemed very proud of his close relationship with his family. Over the next few years, there would be various eyewitness reports of Charles being seen hitchhiking throughout Canada, but none of them could be substantiated. In March of 1992, Denise and a family friend took another extended trip to Kelowna to search for Charles, and would spend the time passing out missing persons flyers, placing advertisements in the newspapers, speaking with local residents, and making public pleas on television for information. Denise once again stayed at the Pandosi Inn, but on March the 17th, an anonymous handwritten note was delivered to her room. It read, quote, "I seen your ad in the paper looking for your son. I seen him May 26th. We were partying and 2 people knocked him out, but he died. His body is in the lake by the bridge." End quote. The note was delivered to the hotel by a cab driver, who said it had been given to him by an unidentified, nervous-looking young man that paid him a $2 tip. It was assumed that the bridge mentioned in the note might be the Okanagan Lake Bridge, aka the Kelowna Floating Bridge. It ran over Okanagan Lake as part of Highway 97 and was in fairly close proximity to the tiny town campground. When Denise took this note to the Kelowna RCMP, they were initially reluctant to check the lake, so a private search effort was organized by the Canadian Search Centre for Missing Children. A team of volunteer divers searched the water near the Okanagan Lake Bridge, and they would soon be joined by the Vancouver-based International Sea Search, aka ISS, who used a mini-submarine with a submersible camera. On day 5 of the search, the RCMP would finally agree to allow their own divers to participate, but on April the 1st, a second anonymous note was delivered to Denise's hotel room. It was once again brought there by a taxi driver and read, quote, "You were searching at the wrong end of the bridge." Well, divers started checking the opposite side of the Okanagan Lake Bridge, and sure enough, on April the 3rd, the ISS mini-sub finally came across a human body about 40 meters deep in the water near the bridge's lift span. The body was subsequently brought to the surface by RCMP divers and identified as being male. At the outset, investigators seemed inclined to believe that the body belonged to Charles, and Denise was left so distressed by the situation that she had to be hospitalized. In fact, Denise did not realize until after she checked in that the police had convinced her to commit herself to a psychiatric ward, and before the body was even identified, the coroner would attempt to pressure her into signing a death certificate for Charles. A number of media outlets initially reported that the body was Charles, but this news turned out to be premature, as the victim in the lake was eventually identified as a 64-year-old Kelowna resident named John Edgar Dixon. Back in May of 1985, Dixon had gone missing after escaping from a psychiatric institution, and the authorities determined that his death was a probable suicide. Even though the person who sent the anonymous notes to Denise was urged to come forward, they never did. This made investigators suspect that the notes may have been hoaxes, and it was just a coincidence that an entirely different body was found in the lake during the search. However, after seeing the news coverage surrounding this case, a man named Gino Bourdin came forward and contacted Denise. Gino claimed that he and his son had befriended Charles while staying at the tiny town campground in May of 1989. Gino described Charles as being a very nice man who made friends with people easily, but he also felt that he seemed a bit naive and trusting. Gino said that he last saw Charles when an all-night party took place at the campground, but then he seemed to inexplicably disappear. Gino confirmed that Charles left his personal belongings behind, and even recalled seeing other people use Charles's tent and sleeping bag after he was gone. If Gino's recollection was accurate, then this almost seemed to lend credence to the anonymous writer's claim that something happened to Charles at a party. Charles's disappearance wound up receiving national attention when it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in January of 1994, but it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. In 2003, Okanagan Crime Stoppers produced a TV segment about Charles's case containing an intriguing lead. An anonymous tipster had sent in a photograph of a middle-aged, gray-haired man who was apparently named Bill and had been seen with Charles at a nightclub in Kelowna sometime in 1989. The Crime Stoppers segment displayed Phil's photograph on screen in hopes he would come forward or that someone else would provide information about his current whereabouts. I read on the website Crime Blogger 1983 that the RCMP eventually identified Bill and learned that he lived in Edmonton, Alberta, but he had passed away, and it was never conclusively established if he ever met Charles. Another interesting lead concerned a man named Tony Gallup, who was charged and convicted of the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a 5-year-old girl named Jessica Koopmans, which took place in Lethbridge, Alberta in May of 2001. It turned out that Gallup had befriended Charles at a marina in Kelowna in 1989 and spent some time hanging out with him before he went missing. In fact, Denise even met Gallup during her trip to Kelowna in 1992. While no evidence could be found to indicate that Gallup was personally involved in Charles's disappearance, he did tell investigators that Charles once went on a boat trip with an unidentified gray-haired man. It's unclear if this man might have been the mysterious Bill, and I'm not sure if this lead ever went anywhere. In 2017, Denise appeared on the TV show Britain's Got Talent as a member of the Missing People Choir. The choir was comprised of family members of British people who had gone missing, and also included the late Peter Lawrence, whose daughter, Claudia Lawrence, vanished in March of 2009 and was featured on episode number 171 of The Trail Went Cold. When the Missing People Choir's performance took place on Britain's Got Talent, photographs of all the missing victims, including Charles, were displayed on screen, and the group wound up finishing 8th and generating a lot of tears from those who watched them. And in an incredible epilogue to this story, one of the missing victims, who was 13 years old when he disappeared, turned out to be alive as he saw his photograph displayed on screen on Britain's Got Talent and decided to get in touch with his mother. Over the past 3 decades, Denise has made no less than 15 trips from England to Canada to search for her son, which came at great personal expense to herself. In order to finance her trips, Denise was forced to sell the hair and beauty salon she owned and refinance the mortgage on her home multiple times until she wound up losing it. Sadly, Charles's father Max died in 2005, and both of Charles's maternal grandparents have also since passed away without receiving any answers about what happened to him. After traveling to British Columbia in 2015, Denise told the media that this would be her last trip there, but she decided to make one final trip to Kelowna 3 years later in order to confront 2 witnesses whom she believed had important information. Denise was contacted by a person who had once been engaged to a former resident of the tiny town campground, and this resident allegedly claimed that they overheard an incriminating conversation in the showers about how Charles was killed and his remains were dumped in the tiny town septic tank. Denise did get to meet this individual's father, but he wouldn't tell her anything, stating that it wasn't worth his own life. Well, Denise wanted the RCMP to take a DNA sample from the septic tank in order to see if Charles's remains may have been in there at some point. This has never occurred. One prominent rumor which Denise has often heard is that Charles may have been murdered by members of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang, as in May of 1989, 75 bikers had traveled from the United States to Falkland, British Columbia in order to attend the Falkland Stampede Rodeo. Falkland is located 90 miles north of Kelowna, and the bikers reportedly stopped at the tiny town campground in order to party there around the time Charles went missing. There was even one tip that Charles may have been killed by a biker who was trying to earn a gang patch. During her final trip to Kelowna, Denise also used the opportunity to fill out some paperwork in hopes that she would obtain a presumption of death statement and deal with Charles's outstanding financial affairs. In August of 2020, the High Court in the United Kingdom finally declared Charles legally dead. At the time of this episode's release, Denise is about to turn 74 years old, and due to her failing health, she does not plan to make any more trips to Canada. However, around the time I started working on this episode, Denise enlisted the aid of Recover, a Vancouver-based missing persons agency which offers pro bono assistance to victims' families. They started a GoFundMe campaign in order to raise $2,500 for an updated age progression sketch for Charles, setting up and maintaining an independent tip line, printing and distributing an updated poster across North America, and covering expenses for volunteer investigators to travel to Kelowna and conduct interviews. At the time of this recording, the GoFundMe has come very close to attaining its goal, and hopefully it will have raised the entire $2,500 by the time this episode comes out. Even if no one is ever prosecuted for Charles's alleged murder, Denise just wants to find out what happened to her son and recover his remains in order to bring him home to England so she can bury him alongside other family members in a cemetery in Cambridge. But after 34 years, there's still no conclusive answers about what happened to Charles Horvath. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So while all missing persons cases are incredibly difficult for the victim's loved ones, it must be a particularly nightmarish and helpless situation when the victim disappears while traveling in a foreign country located thousands of miles away. And that especially rings true when it occurs in a year like 1989, when cell phones were very rare, there was no electronic communication, and if you wanted to talk to your family back home, you'd have to write letters, send faxes, or make incredibly expensive long-distance phone calls, since software like Skype and Zoom were not an option. Since Charles Horvath was traveling through Canada and would only communicate sporadically with his mother Denise, it took her a while to even realize that anything was wrong, and when she finally reported him missing to the RCMP, it had been 3 months since their last communication. And even so, it took forever for Denise to get the police to do anything, since in their eyes, Charles was a legal adult, and it was his right to break off all communication with her and disappear on his own if he wanted to. It would be an entire year before Denise was able to travel to British Columbia and finally nail down the last time Charles was confirmed to be alive, but who knows how much crucial evidence may have been lost. Denise Allan has always been very critical of how the RCMP handled the investigation, and one interaction which really rubbed her the wrong way is when she contacted them about Charles's disappearance from the tiny town tent and trailer park, and Constable Norm Blaney immediately told her that Charles was dead and she would likely never find out what happened to him. When the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries years later, another RCMP investigator, Sergeant Gary Tidsbury, was interviewed, and he tried to backtrack on Blaney's comments, stating that it was Blaney's personal opinion and not the view of the entire police force. But even so, imagine how this must have come across to Denise. For nearly an entire year, the RCMP essentially blew her off and refused to take Charles's disappearance seriously, but once Denise uncovers some of his personal belongings, Blaney immediately reaches the conclusion that he's dead and the case would never be solved. I mean, yes, it is unsettling that Charles left his personal belongings behind at Tiny Town, but at that point, there was no conclusive evidence he was dead. The Tiny Town campground would later change its name to the Willow Creek Family Campground and has since been closed, but back then, it was described as being a rough location containing some shady characters. Blaney's line, quote, "You just do not know how evil they are at the Tiny Town campsite," really makes you wonder what kind of stories he heard about that place. Anyway, when it comes to family members who have diligently searched for their missing loved ones, Denise Allan is definitely one of the strongest advocates I've ever seen, as she's made over 15 trips from England to Canada at considerable strain to her health and finances. This is definitely understandable, given that Charles was her only child, and the fact that she's currently in her 70s and still actively working to seek answers after all these years is truly remarkable, as all she wants to do is learn the truth before she leaves this earth. Like many people, I first became familiar with this case when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1994, and at that point, investigators were still exploring the possibility that Charles might have disappeared voluntarily and was still alive somewhere. Of course, that would be an ideal situation for Denise, knowing that Charles deliberately broke off all contact with her, but at least it would have meant he was still alive. However, here we are 3 decades later, and no one has ever found any concrete evidence to indicate that Charles was alive past 1989, and now that he's legally been declared dead, it seems the most logical explanation is that he was the victim of foul play. The Unsolved Mysteries segment did explore the possibility that Charles ran away on his own, due largely to comments that were made by some of his relatives, who claimed that Charles said he wanted to disappear off the face of the earth so his mother would never find out what happened to him. But upon further research, it was eye-opening to learn that these comments were made by Charles's paternal aunt, who did not like Denise all that much. She was always bitter about how Denise's marriage to Charles's father came to an end, and likely fabricated this story out of spite. But even if you don't take that into account, it makes zero sense for Charles to disappear and leave all of his personal belongings behind at the Tiny Town campground. Yes, I suppose I could see Charles getting rid of his family photographs if he wanted to break off all ties with his past, but why would he leave behind his tent, sleeping bag, and clothing, items he might need if he was planning to travel the country living a transient lifestyle? A potential alternate theory is that Charles could have been feeling suicidal and decided to jump off a bridge into a body of water or kill himself in a remote wilderness area, which would explain why his remains have never been found. Yes, Charles gave off no visible signs that he was feeling depressed or suicidal, but sometimes people can hide this quite well and take everyone by complete surprise when they go through with it. However, there is no real evidence pointing towards suicide, and I believe there is enough shady stuff surrounding Charles's disappearance to suspect foul play. If there's a silver lining to this case, it's that even though Charles went missing while traveling in a foreign country, we do seem to have a fairly solid timeline of his last known movements, as we know he arrived in Kelowna on May the 3rd, and the last confirmed sighting of him took place there on May the 26th. In retrospect, it seems pretty surprising that Charles was there for less than a month, because he stayed at a number of different places and met quite a few people who vividly remember him, such as Joanne Zebroff, Gino Bourdin, and Lou and Libby Sherwood. But I think this just demonstrates what a nice, likable guy Charles really was, though some have said that he came across as a bit naive and could have easily befriended and trusted someone who did him harm. Joanne Zebroff came across Charles while he was sleeping on the streets of Kelowna and let him crash with her and her mother, as Joanne had previously gone on her own backpacking trips and sympathized with Charles's situation. However, Joanne is the person who has complicated the timeline of this case, since she provided 2 separate eyewitness sightings of Charles, which supposedly took place after he was last confirmed to be alive on May the 26th. Of course, one of these sightings occurred when Charles showed up at Joanne's apartment and buzzed her on the intercom, but she couldn't invite him inside because her brother was visiting. Joanne was certain that this incident took place sometime in May, but the RCMP would later contradict her account and state that it occurred in July. As far as I can tell, this was based on the fact that employment records showed that Joanne's brother took time off in July in order to visit her. I know that eyewitnesses can often be mistaken in missing persons cases, but I still find it odd that we have a discrepancy of 2 whole months. One reason I was inclined to believe Joanne's account is because Charles first arrived in Kelowna in early May, meaning that if her recollection was accurate, this encounter would have taken place only a few days or weeks after Joanne first met Charles and let him crash at her apartment. Would Joanne really have been so confused about the timeline that she mixed up May with July? The reason I'm harping on this so much is because if Charles really did visit Joanne in July, where was he after he left the tiny town campground in late May? And how was he supporting himself? Remember, he had a job at Flintstone's Bedrock City and cashed his final paycheck on May the 26th, but no evidence has ever been found to indicate that Charles worked other jobs in Kelowna or anywhere else between then and July. Even though I'm giving Joanne the benefit of the doubt that she didn't mix up the dates, it might be kind of a moot point, since she was the one who reported seeing Charles at the Livewire nightclub in Kelowna in August. It sounds like the RCMP did find her sighting to be credible, since Joanne knew Charles personally, but by Joanne's own admission, she did not actually speak with Charles, and they only waved at each other from across the room. When you're dealing with a loud, dimly lit environment such as a nightclub, I could see how one could mistake a person for someone else from a distance. One lead I've always been confused about is the photograph of the middle-aged man known only as Bill, who was supposedly seen with Charles at a nightclub, though I believe it was a different club than the Livewire. And we have an account of Charles supposedly going out on a boat with a middle-aged man in Kelowna at some point, though it's unclear if this was Bill. Details are murky, but it sounds like the photograph of Bill was provided by an anonymous tipster, though I'm not sure where it originated from, and the tipster obviously didn't provide too many details since investigators were asking for the public's help to find Bill. Even though I've read that Bill was identified, he was never conclusively connected to Charles. But theoretically, if Charles and Bill knew each other, and the sighting of Charles at the Livewire nightclub was legitimate, then perhaps Charles might have befriended Bill and was staying with him between when he left Tiny Town in late May and was seen in August. But once again, why would Charles leave all of his personal belongings behind at the campground, including his identification? Why wouldn't he have made any further contact with his mother, particularly since he was planning to meet her in Hong Kong in August? After all, he had maintained frequent contact with Denise during his entire 8-month trip through Canada, and I see nothing to indicate that he would feel a sudden compulsion to sever all ties with her. And even if Charles did shack up with Bill for a while, what ultimately happened to him? Overall, I am inclined to believe that the sighting of Charles at the Livewire nightclub is mistaken, but investigators have never entirely ruled it out. But for now, let's look at the possibility that something happened to Charles at the tiny town campground on or around May the 26th. Denise has said that the first person she spoke to there was Kevin Trent Egan, who seemed to become very nervous when she mentioned Charles's name and was reluctant to speak with her. This could be seen as a sign that Egan was complicit in Charles's disappearance or knew what happened to him, but it turned out he had Charles's shaving bag and some of his clothing in his possession and had disposed of Charles's identification and photographs. So perhaps Egan was simply nervous about the possibility of getting into trouble for stealing a missing person's items. We know that for several months after Charles disappeared, the campground manager, Phil Flett, kept his personal belongings in storage and initially told Denise he had thrown them out, yet some of Charles's clothing was not only found with Egan, but with Flett's ex-girlfriend as well. However, while giving away another person's belongings might seem sketchy, that doesn't necessarily mean that Flett was complicit in Charles's disappearance. For his part, in 1992, Flett was interviewed in a local news segment which you can find on YouTube and addressed the allegations from the anonymous note that Charles was killed during an altercation at a party which may have taken place at the campground. Flett denied having any knowledge of such an incident and maintained that he had no idea what happened to Charles. In his defense, even though he got rid of most of Charles's belongings, he did hold on to a few personal items, including a rosary, Bible, and a leather strap from a boot, and gave them to Denise. If Flett was orchestrating some sort of cover-up, I'm not sure why he would keep any of these items to begin with, as he could have either pretended that Charles was never at the campground to begin with, or claimed that he left of his own accord and took everything with him. The main reason we know this whole theory about Charles being killed during an altercation at an all-night party is because of the anonymous note Denise received in March of 1992, which led to the authorities performing a search of Okanagan Lake for Charles's body. And bizarrely, this led to the discovery of a second body belonging to an elderly man named John Edgar Dixon, who died in an apparent suicide 7 years earlier. I don't have any further information about Dixon's story, and I initially wondered if perhaps the anonymous letter writer had some sort of inside knowledge about Dixon's death and sent in a false tip about Charles's case in order to compel the authorities to search the lake. This especially rings true when you consider that the writer sent in a second note stating that they were searching on the wrong side of the bridge, and lo and behold, Dixon's body was found a short time later. It seems like the authorities are inclined to believe this was nothing more than a coincidence, and since we do know that Dixon escaped from a psychiatric institution before he went missing, the idea of his death being a suicide is certainly plausible. But of course, this is yet another example of how the RCMP's handling of a situation did not paint them in a flattering light, as they initially did not even want to perform a search of the lake, and only did so after International Sea Search took the initiative to do one. The RCMP's rationale was that the anonymous note was not strong enough evidence to devote money or resources to a search, but coincidence or not, the whole thing did lead to the discovery of another missing individual and provided closure to his family, so it was definitely worthwhile. And then there's the fact that the police tricked Denise into committing herself into a psych ward and tried to get her to sign a death certificate for Charles when the body had not yet been positively identified. This gives me the impression that they just wanted to get Charles's case off their books, and if the body had turned out to be him, I have the awful feeling that they would have just written off his death as a suicide and not bothered to perform a proper homicide investigation. It seems like the RCMP have reached the conclusion that the note was a hoax, and it should be mentioned that the Okanagan Lake Bridge has always been heavily traveled, so it would have been a challenge for someone to dump a body from there without being noticed. But if the scenario presented by the writer was true, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Charles's remains could be in a different section of Okanagan Lake, waiting to be found. The lake has a surface area of 340 square kilometers, so that is a lot of water to cover. Now, we don't have any information about the note's writer, other than the fact that a cab driver said he was asked to deliver it to Denise's hotel room by what he described as a nervous-looking young man. It is certainly possible that the note was nothing more than a cruel hoax, but I do find it interesting that they managed to list the correct date when Charles was last confirmed to be alive, May the 26th. But Denise had been in Kelowna for 2 weeks at that point, and Charles's case had already received a lot of local media coverage, and a number of missing persons flyers were circulated throughout the area, so the writer easily could have gotten a date from there. I used to wonder how the writer knew that Denise was staying at the Pandosi Inn, which, as you recall, was located across the street from the tiny town campground. However, I did find one contemporary news segment on YouTube which showed Denise setting up her room at the hotel as her search headquarters, so it wouldn't have been too hard for the writer to find out where she was. Regardless of whether or not the note was legitimate, it did lead to some important new information, as Gino Bourdin soon come forward, and he confirmed that the last time he remembered seeing Charles was when an all-night party took place at Tiny Town. And afterward, Charles just seemed to vanish without explanation and left all of his belongings behind. Now, I've covered a few cases in which someone went missing or died under strange circumstances after attending a party, and rumors always circulated that something bad happened to them at the party and a cover-up took place. The big issue I always have with this theory is that it would have been very difficult for all the people at these parties to keep their mouths shut for years, if not decades. Yes, we have had a lot of rumors circulate about what might have happened to Charles, but they've never been corroborated. For instance, there was third-hand information that Charles's remains were dumped in the campground septic tank after he was killed, but no hard evidence to support that scenario. We know that a group of Hells Angels bikers from the US supposedly stopped at Tiny Town around the time Charles went missing, but it's never been conclusively established if Charles ever made contact with them. If Charles was killed by these bikers, and other people had first-hand knowledge, I can definitely see them keeping their mouths shut out of fear, but the bikers were not from the area and did eventually return to the US, so why continue to stay silent after so many years? It is important to point out that the writer of the anonymous note stated that Charles was killed while partying was taking place, but they never specifically mentioned Tiny Town. So even if the note is truthful, that doesn't necessarily mean that Charles died at the campground, so it's possible that many of the people associated with Tiny Town, including Phil Flett, legitimately have no idea what happened to Charles, though I'm sure they've probably heard rumors. Since Charles went missing after cashing a paycheck, and the money he received has never been accounted for, perhaps robbery was the motive for his disappearance. If Charles was the victim of foul play, I have a feeling that only one or a small handful of individuals were involved, which is why they've been able to keep their mouths shut for so long. Overall, I do think the explanation about Charles crossing paths with the wrong people and being killed on or around May the 26th, 1989 does make the most sense, but since the police do seem to put some credence into the sighting of Charles at the nightclub in August, I guess I can't completely discount the possibility that he was still alive for at least a few months after he left the campground. But even if that's the case, I have a feeling that Charles was not alive for very much longer, as I don't think he would have gone such an extended period of time without contacting his mother. I've covered countless cold cases in which the victim's loved ones passed away without learning the truth about what happened, and it's always a very heartbreaking situation. Thankfully, Denise Allan is still with us, but I've heard a number of different interviews with her, and it's always sad to hear her express her fear that she will never find out what happened to Charles before she leaves this earth. I've often seen the family members of missing and murdered victims say that they've reached the point where they no longer care about prosecuting the responsible parties, as their top priority is learning the full truth and recovering their loved one's remains. This philosophy certainly holds true for Denise, and she has not yet given up her search for answers, so hopefully, this new GoFundMe campaign to finance a new investigation into Charles's disappearance will turn up some answers. But like many other unsolved cold cases, the one missing piece of the puzzle might be for the right person to come forward with information. So if you happen to know anything about the disappearance of Charles Horvath, please call the Kelowna detachment of the RCMP at 250-762-3300. That's 250-762-3300. Or if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 5 years, our Patreon page has released dozens of exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives. This past month, I released a follow-up to a popular Patreon episode I released last year, where I discussed my top 10 favorite movies inspired by true crimes. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss the 1985 disappearance of George Owens. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 50 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Katie U and Mary S. Thank you so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to provide a plug for another true crime podcast from the Law and Crime Network titled Law and Crime Sidebar, which provides new episodes every Monday through Friday featuring unbiased analysis from two reporters about the nation's biggest true crime stories and trials. They take you inside the courtroom, break down key moments, wins from both sides, sentencing, and victim impact statements. One of their most vivid recent episodes was titled Teen Monster Who Stabbed Cheerleader 114 Times for Thrills, Aiden Fucci Case, which covers the shocking death of 13-year-old cheerleader Tristan Bailey, which took place in an affluent Florida neighborhood in May of 2021. It involves her then 14-year-old killer, Aiden Fucci, pleading guilty to brutally stabbing her 114 times in a premeditated murder for thrills, and the Law and Crime Network's Jesse Weber breaks down this tragic story. So be sure to listen to Law and Crime Sidebar every Monday through Friday on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Anyway, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is being held from September the 22nd to the 24th at the World Center Marriott in Orlando, Florida. Our podcast has a specialized promo code which can be used to get a special 10% discount on tickets, so in order to do so, please visit crimecon.com and use the promo code COLD23. That's COLD23. And in just a few weeks, The Trail Went Cold will also be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place from August the 25th to the 27th at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel in Austin, Texas. We've got a specialized promo code which you can use in order to get a 15% discount on tickets to this event, so if you would like to purchase them, please visit their website at truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use our promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is TRAIL. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.